Yeah, that's fine with
Cool.
recording. Resume the recording. So we will be recording tonight. So yeah. Thanks, Lewis. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks, Lewis, for giving this talk for us. Really excited to hear more about your work. I've muted everyone, but what I'll do is unmute people at the end so we can ask questions. But if you want to drop any questions in the chat at any time, I'll pick them up at the end to ask Lewis. So yeah, thank you, Lewis, and over to you whenever you're ready.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Susie. I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, there we go. Cool. Can you see like an image with a cloud and a hand?
Yeah, that's great.
Grand. Hello. So my name's Lewis Davidson, and I guess within my art, I'm really interested in the found object, and in this sense, sort of the point that I interject with it and the point where I start working with it, but also the relationship that the found object has with its surroundings, its point of value, but also its point of association and meaning. I guess like, yeah, by found object, I kind of, it's not always like a sculptural thing, but it can be like a sound sample or images or photography, but I find it sort of easiest to talk about it as an object. So I first wanted to start talking about 3 series that I started just after my BA and that I finished in 2013. And they're sort of series that I see as being the kind of foundation of my practice or what I'm interested in now. And some of them have carried on as well. So there's obviously a bit of staying power in them in that sense for me. So the first one I want to talk about is a piece called 18 Flags. And I began this work by de-threading the St. George's flag by hand. And I was sort of interested in this sort of quite powerful symbol of identity and territory marking, but also that as an object, it was something movable, but something that was tangible that I could work with just with my hands. So I started de-threading it and turning this symbol into an abstract pile of red and white fibers. And as I was doing this, I started thinking, I wonder how many other flags of the world share just these colors of red and white. And it turned out to be 18 of them. So I started de-threading all of the flags. And I think what I was interested in here was that these symbols that are used to mark different places and differentiate all use the same type of linguistic visual framework. And kind of by accessing this framework, I was intrigued about how I could kind of subvert that in a way. And luckily at the time, there was an open call for something called Art at Tell. It was an exhibition that was to be shown in the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. And for me, making this work for that exhibition was absolutely perfect, because it was sort of around 2014 where in England, this sort of idea of Brexit was kind of being hyped up, and Switzerland seemed to be used quite regularly as a model for independence and a way to promote it. So for me, what I really liked about taking this work to this other place, and of course within these flags, the Swiss flag is there as well, was that there was something that was happening within the piece of this blurring and muddying. And by me going to this other place and bringing the work there, I felt like that was kind of carried on through my actions and this idea of exchange. What was really lucky was that I got chosen to be part of the Art at Tell touring program. And the work also ended up going to Vienna in Austria, which was like absolutely perfect, because of course the Austrian flag is in there too, so it's red and white. And for me, this just sort of carried on the performative quality of the work and beefed up its conceptual groundwork. So another work that sort of has been a bit of a foundation for me are these building blocks that I started, I believe, in 2015, and they've sort of been chugging on since. I guess much like the flags, I was really interested in bricks as lines of definition. Sort of in a sense, they represent home, security, and the sort of sense of belonging and claiming of what's yours and what isn't yours. And also in this sense, they create lines, they create walls that differentiate and mark out. And I was kind of intrigued about this with the brick because at the same time it's made as something handheld that can be sort of held in one hand whilst mortar is being applied. So it's incredibly movable in this sense. I was also intrigued about its relationship with being thrown in protests and how this is very different to notions of stability and home. And this was the work shown as part of Gargle recently. And I guess where the piece began for me was when I was living as a housing guardian with a company called ... And outside our building, there was this green space that was getting used to sort of dump building materials and tools and bulldozers and things like this. And I became really interested in these bricks that had been run over by the bulldozer, but they were sort of submerged into the dirt. And they were kind of still whole, but they had these fracture lines and these breaks running through them. And I was really interested in this and intrigued by this. And I started working with these found break lines in these broken bricks. But I kind of got to a point where the found cracks weren't doing enough for me. And at the same time, I also felt like the work had legs, like it could go somewhere else, or there was potential space in the process that I could get into and move around a little bit more with. And I think this was the point where I decided that instead of working with the found crack lines, why not create my own lines and my own cuts? And I guess within these breaks, I saw an opening that I could work with. So I started working with different brick designs and using a water jet cutter to map out these different drawings. And I guess what I quite liked about this was that there was an element of gameplay that was happening, but somehow with the shapes I was creating, they seemed to have associations with things that looked at like a larger, perhaps more archaic kind of history to them. And I like this because, of course, with bricks, you don't normally look at the individual designs. They're sort of one small part of a whole building. So in this sense, and also in this way, they're something that you normally just see in the everyday. They're sort of parts of the landscape that make up our surroundings. So I liked the idea that through my movements, cutting them and changing the pieces, that I was able to create these associations that changed how they were then looked at. And I currently really like the idea of them seeming almost like found pottery in a sense, because of course they are ceramic and they are clay, but we don't look at them in this way and we don't really ever give them this status. So I think after like 5 years of working on this series, I only felt like I'd kind of worked out how to show it as part of Gargle, which was this inset shelf that Laura suggested. And for me, this worked really, really well because it not only sat into the wall, so it worked with this idea of sort of taking and removing and adding, but also it kind of carried this almost like altar like element that interested me, and it gave them sort of an element of power or value in that way. So this exhibition Gargle was self-initiated by myself, Charlie Vines, and Laura Neef-Blarbin. And we kind of, Charlie was from the RA and Laura was from Goldsmiths. And I was from Slade, and we sort of all won it as after our MA degree shows. So we saw this as being like the perfect way to kind of, oh, sorry. The award meant that we kind of got a free studio for a year and a little bit of money. But we kind of wanted to put on a show at the end just to give it a finale in this sense. And it was really nice to sort of use this as a chance to figure out this work that I'd been making for so long that I wasn't sort of sure about or how to show, but I knew that it had a way of being shown that would have been better. As part of the exhibition, I also showed the other sort of long-standing series that I've been working on called Tags. This is one as part of Gargle, and here's the other one that I also showed in Gargle, and here they are all together. So the tags they literally are exactly what they are. So I found graffiti that was sprayed onto doors, cladding, stone fences, bits of concrete that I could remove, and I took them and then brought them back to my studio and cut them out. And I think for me, that was the thing that I really loved about this work, is that it is exactly what it is. So sort of the paint is the paint that the tagger used, and the surfaces and the sides that you can see are the doors and are the bits of fencing. For me, I was really interested in graffiti tags for a long time, sort of how they're used to mark space and claim territory, whilst simultaneously they are sort of personal names that are put out into the public sphere and let go of. And for me, kind of taking the tag was almost my way of finding a way into the world of tagging whilst not actually tagging itself. In this sense, the nothing is changed about them other than their surroundings. So sort of unlike with the flags and the building blocks where the internal components are moved around, with these, I think what interested me was that they were just this sort of straight take, yet in doing so, it changes everything around them and it turns these 2D marks into something 3D. And in turn, I find it quite interesting how their associations are also changed. So I found, but previously I showed them as part of a like an outdoor sculpture show, and they were clamped onto a bridge, and they ended up having these associations with calligraphy, and people who wouldn't normally appreciate them as marks were relating them to sort of what would be seen as being a higher art form or something like this. I think it's important for me to also say with this work that I never worked with councils or landowners in order to get the tags. I felt like it was important because going about it and not asking permission seemed more in tune with how the tags themselves are sprayed. And in this sense, I wanted to kind of work within this performative language, and I saw it as fitting or almost like respectful to tagging. I think what I really loved about tagging was how it's actually incredibly skillful. You're working, creating the same name over and over again, or adding it flair and repeating it under incredibly difficult circumstances. So you're sort of under pressure from about being caught, but you're also working on rough, uneven surfaces. And for me, I think cutting them out kind of gave a level of homage to these really quick actions by sort of slowly tracing them and taking care in parts which would perhaps be seen as fault lines, like the drips or the overspray and things like this. So yeah, these were the three works that kind of started things for me in terms of my interests and what I still find interesting to this day. I began them all before I started my MA at Slade in 2017, and they've all sort of stayed with me in different ways and fed into other pieces that I'm now working on. So I did my MA at Slade to meet other people and get feedback on my work and have conversations, but I was also really interested in chopping and changing my practice because I'd sort of always been working with these performative sculptures, and I wanted to explore the potential of photography and print, the way that it can work as a window in terms of displacing and taking you somewhere else, But I was also really interested in experimenting and working with sound because it has this incredibly strong associative quality, almost in the same way that smell or taste does. But it's also incredibly invasive and hard to block out. And I found that intriguing as well, the way that it can cut through a space. So this was sort of one of the first pieces that I started playing around with print with at the Slade. And it's, I kept looking at sandbags in the streets and how they were sort of slumped over signage. And I couldn't help but see them as working like bodies without spines. And in this way, I took a picture of my mate's belly and turned it into this fabric print, sewed it up, filled it with sand and made it into this sandbag. And I think what I quite liked about working with photography within this work was how I was able to use the image as a way to impress how I saw an object directly onto it. So I could create this sort of surreal, strange thing. I think though, for me, there was sort of an unexpected consequence when I was making this work that made me stop making it. Although I sort of loved the premise and my intent and where it came from, after making it, I couldn't help but see it as having bad associations with prejudices towards builders as being sort of lazy or builders bums and things like this. So I kind of, and especially from my middle class background, I didn't feel comfortable um, with this work and how it approached this context. So I actually sort of stepped back with it and let it go a little bit. I think maybe in time it might be something that comes up in a different way, and I think it has done, but for the time being, I sort of had to let it go. This was another sort of photographic series that I was working on at Slade, and it's called Caught Between Cladding. So this was around the same time that I was a housing guardian, and around our area there were a lot of building sites, and in turn there was a lot of cladding around the building sites, and on these you had images of the interiors that were being made and these sort of ideal homes that they were promoting. But also at the same time, what caught my eye was that in front of these images, fencing was being left, or signs and traffic cones and things like this. And I was really intrigued about working with a camera to sandwich these objects between the imagery on the cladding and also the image that I took. And I guess in a formal sense, I was kind of intrigued about how this dislocated the object and questioned what was real and what wasn't real. What I also found interesting was that the tools and the elements that are used to create these buildings sit incredibly uncomfortably when they're sort of put into these contexts and into these situations. And for me, I couldn't help but start to think about it as a metaphor for perhaps the people who make these large, fancy buildings are not actually able to sort of own them themselves or sit within these spaces in the same way, or buy like Tom Ford boxes and things like this. So I was kind of, what I think draws me to this work is this friction of the rough objects within this smooth environment, but also in turn how this friction is balanced with the slickness that the elements are sandwiched together. So I was working a lot with photography at that point in time, and I naturally just started drifting back into making objects again. I think it was a tactile element, but also I wanted to sort of shed the conceptual side a little bit. So, oh, sorry, I forgot that one. So I started working with cleaning bottles. These were sort of some of my mum's ones that she had before, and I was cutting them up and putting them back together again in different ways. And I think for me, what sort of drew me into the cleaning bottles was that they were objects that are normally kept out of sight, sort of in the dirty cupboard underneath the sink. But at the same time, they have these incredibly bright, eye-catching characters, designs, and colors. And I sort of wanted to access this. And I started making this piece in between other pieces, but gradually, because I was enjoying it so much, it just took over. And I got really, I really started enjoying playing with form and playing with color, which were elements that I'd not really actually explored before in any way. I guess in this sense, I found them really interesting and sort of fantastic, especially in juxtaposition with their sort of function to hold sort of clinical cleaning materials. I decided to exhibit them on these circular discs of chipboard, which were kitchen sidings. And what I kind of liked about this was that it nodded to where the work had come from, but then it also took it somewhere else. So I felt like the disc had a relationship with shop display and Lazy Susans. So in this sense, it carried on this idea about making visible and kind of raising status. I showed this work as part of Holiday at Arcade. It was during August in 2018, so it was sort of in between my first year and second year at Slade. And this was alongside Anya Peterson and Amy Steele, sort of two fellow Slade students. And we were really lucky. We approached Christian Mooney at Arcade, and he offered us to use the space whilst they were on holiday. So, of course, Holiday seemed like a fitting title for the show. Alongside the cleaning bottles, I first exhibited a series of vac forms that I kind of want to go into a little bit more now. They began with some found packaging. So I remember walking along the street and seeing an empty binoculars case. And what really kind of drew me to the empty case was that I could see by the imprint what had once been sold in it. And this was intriguing to me. And I think the emptiness drew me in as well. So I wanted to kind of take that and fill it with something different. And I initially was filling them with sand because I liked this idea of a tool that is used to see being filled with something incredibly opaque and entropic in this way. But I also sort of was a tactile element that I was thinking about in terms of sand being kicked up into your eyes. And I was working with the found packaging for a little bit, but I started finding it incredibly frustrating because what I was filling the things with, I felt like I had to directly comment and nod back to the packaging and the object. So it felt like a little like I was making these one-liners. And there was kind of a point where I was like, well, why am I buying these products or these packets? Like, maybe this is a chance for me to make my own products, my own sort of wacky things. It was a little bit like with the bricks and these fracture lines, and then deciding to make my own cut lines instead. So I started working with things that I'd found that had been discarded, like broken products and bones and bits of wood, and putting them together in these different combinations. I think it was important for me that these elements had been sort of discarded and were no longer desired. I like the idea of creating packaging for that. And it was funny because after going through with the binoculars, the sand seemed to carry through into the next series as well. I think for me, I liked it at the time in relation to stone carving and wall reliefs and sort of trapped language in this sense. And I was intrigued about that in relation to plastic and a wider future of things breaking down from being forms. But I carried on with this work, and oh, here's some images of the sort of the process of putting these pieces together. I use clay to join up the different parts and sort of make them seem more believable and merging. I think for me, there was a point when I decided that if I was making these ridiculous products, then they might as well be a ridiculous scale. And this sort of opened up something else for me where I started being able to work with larger objects like car parts and things. So there was this spectrum that I started really enjoying working with, and going around to these old sort of dead end fly tipping sites in London and just picking stuff up with a trolley. There was also this point when I first made them when I realized that with this change in scale, that they no longer needed the sand. They didn't need to be so compact, and that they could hold a presence on their own as things that were empty. I think in this sense, I realized that the substance and the subject was in the form and the object that had been there before, as opposed to the sand that I was then putting into them. There was sort of enough in that. I guess that by making them empty, I also felt like there was a spatial element that I could work with. And I really liked the way that they worked as lenses, as things that you could see through and that would distort the space that was there. But in turn, I like this relationship with photography because I thought that for a second I was capturing these strange hybrid components, and yet they're no longer there and they're gone. So I think about them as working as images in that sense. This is the first one I did. It's 1 meter 95 by 95 across, and it's covered in the blue sort of protective layer initially. So the vac forms became like a really big part of my Slade MFA degree show in 2019, which was called Undersoul and Skyhead. I hung them in the space and almost had them flying in formation. And what I liked about this was it had this sense of movement that I felt was fitting with the fact that the products that I'd once had filling them were now absent and no longer there. So this idea of passing through was really important to me. I also wanted them to work as blockers, but also things that could sort of lead you through the space and guide. They were hung from floor to ceiling via wires, so they're sort of tightly suspended. And as part of the installation, I had this large sky print, and this was an image that I took again from cladding, or I think it was from a billboard advertising new flats. And between these sort of utopian sketch out designs for buildings, there was this little 30 centimeter width bit of sky. So I took a photograph of this and blew it up massive. So it was 6 meters by 4. And what sort of really interested me about this was this idea of going into this space and expanding and removing the buildings. And I love this kind of ability that clouds have to be flexible in scale, but also with this kind of double meaning that a blue sky has. Is something sort of optimistic and positive, but at the same time, there's an irony to it now, or a sarcasm. It's almost been used by corporations so much that it's almost too positive to be taken seriously. And what I really liked about it as this backdrop for these shells of fictional products was that it itself is a passing moment that's no longer there. I don't really think about skies as being landscapes as such, but they're just sort of an illustration of a moment in time. There's also a frustration that appealed to me about it as well, because instead of it having a spatial quality as something that you can access and that has a depth, the sky was just this flat image. And again, I like this about this intangibility with the vac forms. Alongside these works, I had a series of bleeps playing from hidden speakers around the space. These were samples and recordings that I had taken from ticket barriers and self-service machines and checkouts and things like this. And I sequenced them into different amalgamations. And what I quite liked is that, a little bit like that, they were sort of signifiers of commerce and passing through. So they were marker points in this sense, which had a lot to do with commodities and things. And of course, this had a strong link with the VAC forms for me. I like this idea of dislocating these sounds and, in a way, taking away the context that they normally have their purpose in. But with this, for some reason, what was interesting to me was that the sense of anxiety or rushing through still seemed to carry in the nature of the noises. Alongside this work, I also had some stickers, and I think they worked well visually in terms of, sorry, how the sounds worked sonically. So these were spaced throughout the space. And this series was originally called What Gathers and Hums Together. And they were little bits of found plastic that I kept noticing on the street and picking up. And I would take them back to the flat copy machine at Slade and photograph the different combinations that I was making. And what I found interesting was that these broken pieces from different places could join up and make new wholes. And in this sense, how I could turn objects that were overlooked, broken, and disregarded into symbols or sigils or a language that seemed to have some sort of value and seemed to work with advertising and formats that are sort of incredibly large and scream to be looked at normally. And I kind of want to come back to this series a little bit at the end, because I guess it's sort of these works have fed back into what I'm really interested in at the moment. I also made a series of temporary tattoos as part of the opening. It was just sort of a fun thing in a way, but what I did quite like about it was that the installation had a feeling of passing and of change. And in this sense, I like the idea that people would leave the space with part of it stuck onto them. So after graduating, I was very lucky to be asked to be part of a show at Unit 1 Gallery Workshop in West London called Adjacent Directly. And for me, this was quite a useful show in a sense, because I'd been building all of these different series together and looking at them incredibly closely for a while, with the aim of my degree show in mind. So for this exhibition, it was a really great chance to sort of separate elements and see them individually. I hadn't really considered in a strange way before that the VAC forms could work just as singular sculptures on their own. And the blue sky could sort of work as a backdrop for other pieces as well as my own. Yeah, this was really great to kind of be able to take my hands off the steering wheel. And what I quite liked with the VAC forms and how the director Stacey curated them was that they worked as these steps and these staggers through the space, interrupting works, but also guiding the viewer towards others. I think I also really enjoyed how other works blurred with them when you were looking through them. And in this way, they took on different associations from the original objects that they used to house. I especially like them here with this microscopic image of seeds. And I think it carries this strange kind of deep underwater feeling with the claw-like kind of shape of the VAC form. So this summer, I was part of a show called Inner Space. This was when I was working for an artist called Oliver Beer, and himself and Nick Hornby very kindly organized a show to show all of the artists that worked for them as assistants. And this was really kind of quite a great experience in a way. So this was in Oliver's studio, which was incredibly rough. And alongside us, we also had works by Dan Sachs, Lynn Chadwick, and Henry Moore. So it was this very like interesting spectrum of artists at different points in their careers. But also what I liked was that there was also a spectrum of texture in regards to like this really rough space, but then these very clean works. And for me, I really liked exhibiting the vac forms here because they were incredibly clean, but they were also originally composed of rough objects that jarred and were put together in different ways. And I like this with the space because you have these sort of tiles and then there's sheets of plywood interjecting or piping going up into a dirty ceiling. Yeah. I think I also realized as well that I could use the rough space in the same way that I worked with the blue sky before. So instead of having it as an image, it could kind of, the pieces could take on the actual sky in this sense. Yeah. Right. So I wanted to come back to these stickers, and I kind of put the pieces of plastic away after making the stickers, and they've just sort of, they were under my bed for a year and a half in a little bag, and I always felt like as a work that it didn't quite do what I wanted it to, or that there was sort of something more to it in a way. And I took them out this summer and started working with them as little sculptures. And sort of instead of photographing them, what if I stick them together and if they are just objects in this sense? I think originally for me, what intrigued me about photographing them and having them as prints was that it created this distance between the source and what the images became. And I felt like in a way this was a good way to change their status and disregard the sort of rough qualities. But when I started working with them as little objects, what I really loved was that there was this feat or this potential there was this sort of feat or potential in them still being these rough objects while simultaneously being able to kind of convince a purpose or a different type of value with them, and to see them in a different way, especially when you have components that are recognizable that you know as like pen lids or things like this. I like this push and pull of them being something before, but also convincing into something else. So I started assembling them in different ways. And I think initially I still had in my head this idea of them as images, and I was working with them in a very flat kind of face-on way. But the more that I worked with them as sculptures, I realized that they had a broader associative potential in terms of what they could relate to and be. Whereas previously I thought a lot about logos, symbols, linguistics. In their 3D qualities, they could kind of become, they could relate to value in a different way. So they could relate to jewelry or souvenirs. And souvenirs stuck with me in particular. I think this was because I see the souvenir as something that marks a particular place that is seen as being of importance, and it's your experience of going there and you say, oh, I've been there, I've got the thing. And this was a valuable experience. So for me, with these little bits of plastic, I like the idea that they're the opposite of this, that they're sort of things that have been discarded and are unwanted, but also pieces that I've just picked up randomly at different points along the street, on the pavement, on my way to work. But by taking and assembling them in different ways, they sort of, they have a raised status in this way. And to me, when I'm doing that, I think that their sort of significance and their placing changes. I think I was actually thinking about them a lot in relation to 18 flags when I was putting together this talk, because with the flags, I was taking these symbols of value and importance, and I was sort of de-threading them and turning them into different components and abstracting them. Whereas with this work, I kind of see it as being on the same spectrum, but at the other end. So it's taking these different little bits, but then assembling them and putting them together and using that process as a way of saying, this sits within a different type of value or importance or significance. Again, a little bit like with the cleaning bottles, I think they are something where I like having a broad game that I can be playful within. And I often find that I can be most playful with things that are seen as not being as being dirty or yeah, I don't know. I find it very hard to be playful with things that are incredibly formal or well respected. So I started doing the duo residency at Unit 1. Unfortunately, this was cancelled partway through due to coronavirus. But I wanted to kind of dedicate my time there to working on this series, which I'm now calling Roadside Picnic. And initially, when I got into the space, I felt incredibly fazed by like the grand scale of it. And then I slowly kind of realized that this was absolutely perfect for the work. I guess in the same way with the flags, but taking them to a different country made sense. I felt that showing these things that were previously overlooked in a really large space was a way of giving them this focus and this attention, but also grandiose as well. And I really feel like during this time at the residency, brief as it was really great for the series. I started working with them a little bit larger, but I also started, as you can see, the one on the right, kind of playing more with these three-dimensional qualities. And I think what intrigued me about playing more with the 3D was that I was able to put function and purpose into them. And I think this grounded them more, or it made them feel more real than they ever did before as symbols or language. And I kind of like this because it helped the work lean more into this strange kind of logic or world that I was envisaging them in. And it took them away from sort of their beginnings a little bit more. I've been thinking more and more recently about this and making like stop frame animations of some of them and having this kind of movement and these sort of clicking noises that I really love about the plastic and this quality it has. So I sort of want to go further and further into this world and into this sort of strange logic. I think as well at the time, it was funny when I pulled them out from underneath my bed as loose bits. I think because there were so many things happening online and everything felt quite distant and hard to get to, these little pieces felt incredibly tangible and they felt like something I could work with. And I guess the breadth of association that I could put into them and the breadth of color and form felt like a realistic way to sort of express or yeah, to express. So recently, as part of Gargle, the exhibition with Charlie and Laura, we were really lucky to get Arts Council funding. So as part of this, we're making a publication. And I used this as a bit of a chance to experiment with taking these little bits outside and photographing them more in the settings that they came from. I was kind of intrigued about this, and I'd wanted to do it for a while, and this felt like a good opportunity to make myself do it. I guess I'm intrigued about creating a world for them in this way to back up their logic. And in the same way that I work with the bricks, I've been looking a lot at paving slabs and this idea of making a paving slab print. What happens when you take something from the ground and put it onto the walls? Much in the same way with the little bits of plastic, how their status is changed from these sort of things you step on to something that you look at, almost like stone carving in this sense, or something you would admire. I've always been really interested in those little names drawn into wet tarmac. And I'm kind of, I guess this is sort of the part where I'm at the moment that I'm interested in. Yeah, and that's the end.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.
Right.
I'll just allow people to unmute themselves and we can do some questions. One sec. As we do, I'll just stop your screen share and maybe do or keep it on speaker view. Does anyone have any questions? You should all be able to unmute yourself now. Yeah. Any questions? If not, I've got a few. I'll start. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about I found the fact that you work across such a range of different processes and mediums like really, really interesting, and like it doesn't feel like you, like I don't know, I probably as a creator like feel like I'm stuck in like one way of working quite a lot, but you seem to like take everything, like you're doing vac forming and then you're doing water jet, and I just wondered if you talk a little bit about how you decide about what processes you want to use, or are there particular processes you definitely really want to use going forward or equally don't want to use at all, and kind of how do you navigate those different processes?
Yeah, I guess I've always sort of followed ideas, or sort of it would be something I notice that I'm keen on, and then I go into that. And I think I've always ended up sort of riding the idea through the processes, and it sort of pulled me through these different ways of working. Yeah, I guess like when I think about my work, I think about the themes, and sometimes I get stuck in techniques. But really it's maybe more about sort of what's valuable to me that I'm trying to get to, and sort of pushing through different things in different landscapes. But I guess I've got I feel like I've got a different problem in respect to what you're saying, where I've always found it difficult to stay with a series and build on it and see it out to the end and sort of slow down with it in this sense. And I think for me, that's why they always seem to come back in different ways. At points, there's sort of, I need a lot of distance to be able to see something in a way that could be stronger, perhaps. And I find actually working with lots of different things a really useful way of getting that distance, so I can kind of go on to something else where I'm working with print, or I'm sort of collaging sound together. And because doing that was so different to working with clay and putting these objects and thinking about how flat they are, it means that when I come back to those clay objects, I'll come back from a different angle and it opens up again. Yeah. But I write a lot as well. So I sort of write a lot about what my thinking patterns are doing and where I'm going with them. And I guess in the same way that with the little plastic sculptures where I'm assembling these different things and thinking about their associations, I spend a lot of time doing that between pieces as well, and sort of thinking about the gaps, maybe. Yeah.
I was also wondering if you could talk a little bit about, so your vac form pieces, a couple of the first image, I think it was the one at Unit 1 gallery, where you've got the very controlled space, you've got the print on the back of the clouds, and then you've got the vac forms hanging in front, and you're kind of really controlling that viewpoint. But then when I saw them in person, it was at the couple at Oliver's studio, and it was kind of interesting to see how they interacted with the space around, both the windows at the far end, but also on the wall behind, where they had the graffiti and the kind of like layers of paint. I just wondered how you feel about how much control you want to give to the overall space, or is there an optimum viewing situation for those works?
Yeah, I don't know. There's been a bit of a learning process for me, actually. Because funnily enough, like the day before I showed them in Oliver's space, I used one of the sort of blank white spaces below. And in that room, I felt like I had too much, like the situation was too clinical. It was too clean. And when I photographed them and I looked at them, you couldn't see that they were see-through because there was nothing on the other side as much to look through. So in a weird way, I found with that work that obviously, because it's see-through, it's incredibly reactive to where it's shown. But when I'm too controlling with it, it takes the air out of it and it stops it. It stops it sort of functioning in a way, and being active. Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed seeing it I haven't, it's a shame because I wish I'd seen it in both situations actually, because I did really enjoy seeing it alongside the kind of like griminess of that space at Oliver Studio. And now seeing, because I didn't know about your graffiti works then, now to make those connections, it felt really right.
Yeah, it's funny you say. I thought about putting the tags in for that show, and I didn't, because it could be opposite reasons for putting the vac forms in. Like I thought that they would blend too well, they were too rough for it. Like, yeah.
Have we got any questions before I take over with more? anyone in the audience got anything you want to ask? I've got a few more written down. Surprised Vic's being so quiet. She normally has a million questions. Vic, what's going on?
I'm very tired.
You always have at least.
Thank you, Lewis. Yeah, I'm also, my house is a shambles right now. I'm just observing. I'm trying to get just a little bit of art in my life right now.
On spot. Oh, we've lost her.
I guess, well, okay, here, I'll think of a question. How's this? Since you put me on the spot.
Right.
I don't know, because I missed the first few minutes. So, but I was just wondering how you chose to start working with plastics as a material versus anything else necessarily.
Yeah. I think it came like from the found object. So it was just from seeing the found packaging that drew me towards it. Yeah, it's kind of funny because I know they've got like this sort of huge environmental connotations, but in a strange way, I think they sort of go into that, but they're not. And I've had to sort of tread around that in different ways. But in a sense, I don't think it's sort of my personal soul drive within the work. I think what I am interested in is this idea of preservation and change. And I do think plastic is quite interesting in relation to that, how people discard it, but also how it's pristine when it's newly bought. But also I found with, especially the little assemblages that I've been making, how there's this sort of like punchy breadth of color that it holds. And this sort of interests me, this double identity that it has, because on the one hand, it's playful and it's seen as having a relationship with children's toys, which are sort of things at the beginning of life. But then it has this huge sort of future ramifications of lasting and being, instead of like friendly and playful, becoming toxic and acidic. And I guess in this, for me, the colors are actually the reasons why I notice it everywhere, because they sort of punch out in that way. Yeah.
I think, any last questions? I've got a few more, but I feel like I've monopolised it. I'll ask you over a beer when we're allowed to.
Yeah.
So unit 1 that's on for the rest of how long? I think you said, but I've forgotten already.
Oh yeah. So the unfortunately the duo residency was cancelled. But I think we're going to do something next year at some point. We just got to like nail it down. And there's an exhibition called The Invitational that opens this Friday. I think it's from 11 till 9. You have to like book a thing to rock up. But that's showing a selection of artists that they've had as part of residencies before. So it's like just like a big group show.
How long is that on for?
Slightly indefinitely. Like it's, I think it says like January, so I don't know how much of January. Yeah.
The duo residency, is it going to be rearranged, or is it just?
I think we're not. I think we're just not sure at the moment. I think because everything is so turbulent, it's a bit tricky. And Christian Ocampo, the guy that I was doing it with, he's sort of potentially finishing his MA at Slade from Easter onwards. So it's about, yeah, it depends how we can kind of navigate that and Corona. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. Hopefully we get to see it. It looked really exciting.
Yeah. Thanks. Cheers.
We do so every time, but everyone could just unmute and give Lewis a round of applause. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Well, thank you.